I had a lot of expectations around being able to make a difference and a poor understanding of a stressed health system. Staying in clinical research is an area where we can see tangible differences for patients. We saw people go from shells of themselves into really happy, healthy individuals.
Hey guys, it's Charles and welcome to Chat GCP, a medical science clinical research and commercialization podcast. On today's episode, we have a special guest from the PCR network, Dr. Paul Hamilton, here to talk about clinical research in New Zealand and the latest and greatest. So welcome, Paul.
Yeah, thank you very much, Charles. It's good to be here. I think our initial conversation about this was probably about 6 months ago. So
I know how quickly
we've both managed to schedule some time.
Yeah, I know how quickly has time gone by. I said to a friend the other day, like, I'm thinking of the year in quarters, and we're almost a quarter of the way through the year. It's just insane. Went by like that. But yeah, great to finally have you here to chat. Now, clinical research is, and especially in New Zealand, it's not one of those, obvious career progressions or careers to get into like de novo or like from the beginning. Myself kind of fell into the clinical research game. You're clinically trained, so what was your experience pivoting from, conventional medicine into the clinical research space? Because it's not an immediately obvious career path, right?
Yeah. I'd probably challenge you a little bit on that, just splitting it between the early phase and the late phase research. I think a lot of late phase researchers will be presented with opportunities through their regular medical and clinical work. They'll be seeing the patients either in a GP surgery or as a hospital specialist, and they might be approached by a CRO directly because they've got access to that patient population. Early phase I see as being slightly different, and probably the vast majority of early phase investigators have actually fallen into it. A bit of blind luck, a bit of serendipity, and a lot of good fortune along the way that the trials have kept coming to this part of the world.
Yeah, interesting. So was there like a particular eureka moment where you thought, I want to get into the early phase clinical research space? Did you have prior experience with later phase stuff through your clinical work?
I would say that, like a lot of junior doctors, I had a lot of expectations around being able to make a difference and a poor understanding of a stressed health system. I think that's probably a typical story which you will hear time and time again.
Yeah.
I had spent about 5 years working in clinical medicine through various hospital departments. We would see the same patients coming back through ED time and time again. We would be able to address the acute issue. A couple of weeks later, we would see the same person back with very similar set of problems. It seemed like a revolving door where we could help a little bit, but not address fundamental problems.
Yeah. Putting a Band-Aid over it and the underlying cause is still there, and they'll present to you again in a couple of weeks. Gosh, that would be demoralising. Well,
I think it is for a lot of junior doctors, and I would say probably the majority of people that have come into the clinical research space since I've been there, and I think I've probably had a hand in training probably 2/3 of the early phase investigators in New Zealand now, is that many of them have felt dissatisfied with clinical medicine and they've sort of been looking for some kind of alternative. Not necessarily sure about much of clinical research, but looking for a change and looking for an area where they feel that they can actually make a difference.
Right. So it's, being dissatisfied or demoralised about the current status quo, looking for another opportunity or an alternative career path, and stumbling upon early phase clinical research.
Yeah, that's very much been the case for me, and I would say for the majority.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
My own journey into clinical research, I guess, began with moving from a locum position in the hospital into a part-time role at Auckland Clinical Studies, and that was just 3 days a week. And I thought I would probably do this for a year or two, then go back and resume a career in hospital medicine.
Right.
Exactly what that area was going to be, I wasn't entirely sure at the time.
Yeah.
But I didn't really appreciate the opportunities and the ability to actually forge a career in clinical research in this country at the time.
Yeah, and there's actually there's a fair amount of phase or earlier phase research happening in New Zealand. We kind of touched on it before we got rolling, but the fact that you don't have to open up an IND with the US FDA to do a phase 1 study or even a phase 2 study in the country is really attractive. You can bring a trial here for a new product and fairly cost effectively run it. I mean, we've got a good population, there's enough heterogeneity, enough homogeneity that it's not, like a Southeast Asian country, for example, which would be a little bit more tricky. So it's a really attractive place to run clinical trials, early phase clinical trials. So over your career, you would have touched on a bunch of different therapeutic areas, different, treatment modalities in your work.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll just come back to your point a little bit about the diversity. Increasingly, what we're seeing from sponsors and CROs is that they do need to include a diversity plan as part of their trials. And I think that's probably going to stand New Zealand in good stead going forward with quite a diverse population and just very good access through the sort of primary care networks that we have for patients to be able to access clinical trials.
So I haven't heard about that before. That's really interesting. So a diversity plan is that for the trial to ensure that they have representative sample of different demographic groups in the trial, and it has to be built into it somehow through the selection of locations?
It's something which is sort of coming through from regulators. Particularly, I've heard it from US FDA, that a diversity plan in terms of age diversity, ethnicity, all those kind of key areas are required across all of the phases of a new asset being developed.
Yeah, so you get a representative sample of the world in your clinical trial. How do they achieve that though? Is it selecting different regions, countries, sites within those countries?
Yep, that's right, and a bit of it does fall onto the sites and the investigators as well.
Yeah.
We've not yet been asked specifically to present a diversity plan as part of sort of pitching for a new trial. But I'm aware that the CROs certainly are getting asked those kind of things now, and obviously they will be factoring that in when looking for different sites around the world and different populations that investigators have access to.
Yeah, absolutely. So what have been the different therapeutic areas or drug modalities that you've been fortunate enough to work with? I imagine it's quite a range in early phase work.
Yeah, plenty of things. So I started with that part-time role back in 2011 with Auckland Clinical Studies, and as I mentioned, I expected that to last maybe 1 or 2 years, and then I would probably move on. The really pivotal study, and I know you've heard about this on a previous podcast, was the Electron trial in the hepatitis C patients. There's a kind of interesting meme which I tend to include in presentations when talking about this study, and it's along the lines of why do new medicines always have side effects like suicidal thoughts or anal leakage? Why is it never invisibility or spontaneous orgasms? And I kind of take that back into the previous treatment paradigm for people that had hepatitis C, which was, for the majority of people in New Zealand with genotype 1 infection, 12 months of pegylated interferon therapy plus oral ribavirin. And it was really a hideous treatment for the majority. It tended to cause almost universal fatigue, depression, changes in a lot of the blood counts, which required either transfusions or stopping treatment periodically. And it was a long haul, especially for people that might still be facing the challenges of homelessness, substance abuse,
Right.
difficulty with access to treatment, and good transport options. So it was a really arduous treatment for those people, and the development of the direct-acting antivirals, which we saw, I guess, especially with the electron study, where it was really life-changing and a real paradigm shift for the treatment of that disease, was that you could treat with oral therapy with minimal side effects for as little as 6 weeks and end up with 90% plus cure rates.
Yeah.
So it made a massive difference, and although that was an early phase trial, we were seeing people walk out the door that had been infected for 30 years, tried multiple courses of therapy, and after just a few short weeks, they were cured.
Yeah, and that was one of your first experiences
Yeah,
in phase 1 research.
Yeah.
So you would have been just hooked on it right, straight after that. I mean, that's Sofosbuvir, right?
That's right.
And that's almost universal now in the treatment of hepatitis C, and has cured millions upon millions of people. I think previous guest of mine mentioned that it's cured countless millions in places like Egypt, where it's almost, well, not quite universal, but it's so common that it's an enormous drain on their economy. And having a treatment like Sofosbuvir that was studied all those many moons ago at a phase 1 unit in New Zealand is a pretty cool story. So have you had any other great successes since then, or has that been like the most amazing, resounding success?
I think that was the one which really convinced me that staying in clinical research is an area where we can see tangible differences for patients. This wasn't a revolving door anymore. This is something which was resulting in cures and changes to people's lives.
Absolutely. So that almost the antithesis of your experiences in clinical medicine for a while.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I think the other treatment program which we were involved in at Auckland Clinical Studies was the development of Danicopan, which was with a small biopharma called Achillion, and this was for an acquired genetic condition called paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria, or PNH, and essentially the only treatment available for those people was either getting quite frequent blood transfusions whenever they had a flare, so that would sort of manage their symptoms, or taking an incredibly expensive monoclonal antibody therapy, which wasn't, of course, funded here, which was eculizumab, and that's a complement C5 inhibitor, which basically stopped your complement proteins from attacking your red blood cells.
Yeah. And the complement is that archaic version of our immune system, right? It's part of the innate immune system. It's kind of super evolutionary conserved across different species, right? So it's fairly basic, fairly blunt tool, and sometimes it gets misdirected towards your own body.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
So we were involved in quite a number of studies with this compound, and that took us all the way through from first in human exposure in healthy volunteers through single ascending dose, multiple ascending dose, food effect trials, and then eventually into a patient population in a number of studies which we did over several years with Professor Peter Browett. And again, this is something which was just completely revolutionary for the treatment of this condition, and it made such a difference to the small population in New Zealand. But what a significant difference! We saw people go from just shells of themselves into really high-functioning, fully engaged, happy, healthy individuals.
Well, that's remarkable. And we're kind of moving in from like a very, I hate to use the term again, but blunt tools, blunt medicines, blunt tool medicines, to more targeted medicines. And over time, it's only getting more and more targeted, more and more specific, and ideally, fewer off-target effects. So you've got your small interfering RNAs that go after a very specific sequence. You've got your antisense oligonucleotides, and then you've got things like CRISPR, which are even more targeted and can change your genetic sequences to correct for a mutation. We're really heading into a very much a personalized medicine future. But the research is happening now, and we'll see the benefit of it, 5, 10, 15 years. These things take time. And it all begins with these phase 1 studies.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Why don't you break down for us the different types of early phase studies? You mentioned normal healthy volunteers, and then there's other end of the spectrum, like food effects. So what different types of studies are there under that early phase banner?
Yeah, so I guess in training to be an early phase investigator, what we're really talking about is the phase 1 and 2 trials, but those can be further broken down. Our phase 1A trials, for the majority of indications, unless, as you mentioned, we're talking about a very specific genetic mutation which is only present in the patients, those trials are often conducted in healthy volunteers. It's generally fairly small numbers, but typically the first kind of design is a single ascending dose study, which does what it says on the packet. It's a single dose, and those doses increase between the cohorts with a safety review, reviewing all of the information that's available before electing to go to that next dose level or not. Those studies tend to be fairly intensive. And by that I mean a lot of assessments for the people that are involved. Participants usually end up having to stay in the unit, so we need a specially designed unit which is able to cater for overnight stays and not only do all of the medical tests but also keep healthy young people amused and entertained for a few days or weeks.
What's more difficult?
Those trials will then usually progress into multiple ascending doses, where there might be just 2 or 3 doses or anything up to a month of dosing. And again, those are often conducted in healthy volunteers. There's often a food effect part, especially for small molecules, because, of course, these are completely new drugs. We might have some sort of indication whether or not the drug is better taken with food or on an empty stomach, but this needs to be tested, and this is, I guess, coming back to why are we doing these clinical trials in the first place? Well, I guess it's because doctors like to think that we're practicing evidence-based medicine, and this is the evidence base. This is where it comes from.
Yeah.
So when you see those labels on the prescription drugs, this is where all the information comes from. It says you're taking this on an empty stomach twice a day. It's these trials which have helped to determine all of those factors.
Yeah. So the single ascending dose, you're really trying to find the optimum dose in terms of a safety profile, or within a range. So that range, how is that range typically determined? Is that based on previous animal studies or comparator drugs?
Well, I guess there's a limited amount which you can get from a healthy volunteer that hasn't got the condition. Part of determining the right dose is obviously the safety. So there's a lot of questions for people on those studies around their health, multiple times a day. Have you had any changes in your health? And assessing for any sort of adverse events which could possibly be related to the new drug. We're also looking at the kinetics of the drug, and there can be some useful models which have been designed through preclinical testing, which can help to sort of predict whether or not we would see a saturation point, with complete receptor occupancy and no further effect, or whether or not you can continue to increase the dose and continue to see further effects, because perhaps there's a sort of downstream mechanism which gets triggered by the receptor occupancy.
Interesting, yeah.
So that's part of it. That's what you can determine from the healthy people. But then, of course, you need to move into a patient cohort. And the proof of concept part also tends to fall under that sort of early phase banner, sort of 1B, 2A studies. And often this is just a small group of kind of cherry-picked patients with nice stable disease, not taking anything else in terms of other medications, and no other sort of concomitant diseases or conditions which might influence what's happening. And then we can start looking at initial efficacy with the drug as well, and working out whether it's actually doing what we expect it to do for a patient population. And that all helps to sort of guide the dose which gets taken forward into subsequent trials.
Yeah, so that patient selection piece is really important, right? Because you don't want to have too much noise, background noise, that could confound any signal that you are wanting to see in terms of its safety or efficacy. You called out the not too many other concomitant diseases, because that might be misconstrued or confound the safety evidence, and so that the patient population that you would see in an early phase proof of concept trial in patients would be quite different to that population that might go through in a phase 3 trial, where it's more broad, less specific, a bit more noise going on in a phase 3 trial, because you've got a fairly heterogeneous population.
Yeah. I guess as the phases progress, some of that eligibility criteria can be relaxed somewhat, so that you do see people that might be taking some other medications, perhaps their blood pressure's a bit high, they might have diabetes, something like that. All that other noise in the background, we can sort of factor that in the later phases. But for the early phase proof of concept part, you want to keep that population as clean as possible.
Yeah. Here's a quick message from today's sponsor, SAPPRO, your clinical trial pathway partner. Engaging with SAPPRO as your clinical trial pathway partner will keep you and your collaborators on track, ensuring your strategic objectives are met and that your product is approved as soon as possible. For the small biotech or pharmaceutical company, SAPPRO offers tailored CRO solutions from start to finish with their reliable alliance partners. I suppose that's kind of a byproduct of the sample size, right? If you only got 10 patients, you can't have really any noise, because it will dampen down your signal, because the signal might be fairly weak. Whereas if you've got 300 patients in your phase 3, you kind of can't afford to have a little bit of noise, because there's enough power there.
Yeah, it's true.
Really interesting. So why don't we pivot to your current exploits with PCR Network? So that has been evolving over time, and the latest iteration is a brand new early phase unit on the North Shore of Auckland. Beautiful building, by the way. Great setting too, right by the bridge. But what was the genesis behind another phase 1 unit in Auckland for PCR Network?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great compliment for the build, which has had quite a long gestation, I think, as you know. And I think what's been really great in joining PCRN almost 12 months ago now is that as a clinician that's been involved in a lot of early phase trials, I've managed to have some input into the design of the place. And, it's a custom-built facility. Everything's on the same level. We've got a pharmacy just a few steps away from the clinical unit where the dosing occurs. The laboratory, similarly, is all on the same floor. And the footprint of the ward is in a sort of L configuration. so you can effectively have two separate wards which can be handled quite differently, with perhaps different trials going on or different set of patients versus healthy volunteers, but it's all contained within that same sort of overall footprint.
Yeah, so it's been purpose built to serve serve as a perfect setting for early phase research, so people can come, stay as long as they need to. If it's a normal healthy volunteer, maybe a few days, play some Xbox, go into a booth and call their mum.
There is a truly gigantic television.
That's excellent.
Which has been well used so far by the volunteers staying in.
I bet. As I mentioned, I think it might be more difficult to occupy those young, normally healthy volunteers than it is to keep tabs on their medical condition. But yeah, so naturally there's a early phase unit in New Zealand Clinical Research, Grafton, Auckland, that formerly ACS, which is the site that you mentioned. So having another unit in the same city really does illustrate how there's a huge opportunity for more research, early phase research in New Zealand. It's quite encouraging, right? That this is a good place to do good research.
Yeah, I mean, the business case which was put forward for building another early phase unit really identified that there was a need, and obviously the population centre in Auckland was looked at. And I guess what we have is in central Auckland and to a lesser extent in the south of Auckland, some really good, effective clinical trials units that are servicing their local population. What the North Shore has been lacking is access to a lot of early phase trial space. I've had a lot of conversations with the different research groups in North Shore Hospital. They're doing some fantastic work, but they're also turning down a lot of studies because they haven't got the space or the study coordinator or the ethics administrator to be able to manage those sort of logistical aspects of setting up a trial. So what we're really hoping to do with situating a new early phase, or multi-phase, I should really say, unit on the shore is to be able to service the Waitemata district. It's in District Health Board days, it was the largest district health board by population in the country. It's almost 750,000 people that have really been a little bit underserved. So the placement for that unit is very good.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also a very diverse region, the Waitemata. I mean, it's not called that anymore, like you said, but on the western side, it's typically young, less affluent. On the eastern side, it's older, more affluent. It's quite weird that was one district health board with such contrast geographically. But that's a good thing in clinical trials. And obviously, a clinical trials unit, I imagine you might be, you said multi-phase, so are you considering doing later phase work out of there as well?
Yeah, we're seeing quite a lot of opportunities come through for both those proof of concept trials, plus a number of later phase studies as well.
That's great.
I guess PCRN has traditionally worked within that later phase trial space. They've got a fantastic reputation for vaccine studies and those trials which can be based out of primary care. So a lot of the approaches which we've been seeing over the last few months at least have sort of focused on those traditional areas of strength for the group. But I think there's been a lot of excitement. The CROs are telling us this is a fantastic place.
So it's like re-educating the usual players that you're now operating in the early phase space as well. A new unit.
And we're seeing a lot more of those early phase opportunities coming through. More so the phase 1B proof of concept patient groups at this stage, but also a handful of the healthy volunteer trials as well.
Yeah. Where does your interest lie predominantly? Is it the normal healthy volunteers? Is it the proof of concept patients, or is it the scaling up into the later phase, get the patient in, test in as many possible, as many as possible?
I'll say something a little controversial, given that my job title is the Clinical Director of Early Phase Research. Seeing endless healthy volunteers doesn't make a great medical career.
Sure.
I think that clinical trials have a greater responsibility than that, especially in a country like New Zealand, where there is restricted government funding for new medications. In speaking to, oncologists and hematologists about the early phase unit, one of the big selling points, which we've really been able to emphasise, is that, your patients will get access to the best standard of care, which is available, funded by the sponsor. They may also get this new fantastic investigational drug, which may or may not help them even more. But either way, they're going to be getting the very best standard of care paid for by the sponsor. And this is access to treatments which New Zealand patients can't otherwise easily get. And I think trials, or the whole clinical research community in general, does bear some responsibility for helping to provide that top level of care for patients.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had a number of conversations on this podcast about this very issue, which I find kind of sobering in a way. We consider ourselves in New Zealand a modernized, first world country, but in terms of access to new medicines, we really are falling behind really rapidly. And a lot of the heavy lifting is actually now being done by clinical trials in terms of getting access to the latest and greatest. I mean, in my day job, I'm doing a clinical trial right now, globally, 100 odd sites, 17 countries. And like you mentioned, everyone is getting the best standard of care drugs plus 2-to-1 ratio getting our investigative treatment as well, or not. And it's, there's just almost like a no-brainer. If you're a patient and you've exhausted other avenues that you have available, and someone comes along and say, hey, I'll give you something that they get in the States without even thinking about it for free, and we'll look after you, we'll see you every 2 weeks, give you additional care. And also you have the potential of getting what could be the next blockbuster, say. Pretty good proposition if you're a patient.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then for the people like yourself, the investigators, you're staying up to date with the latest technology and innovation. It's all very exciting.
So I guess to come back to your question, I like a mixture of phases.
Yeah, so the normal healthy volunteers, it's a means to an end, right?
Yeah.
You have to do that before you can go into a patient.
We don't get to those patient parts without doing the healthy volunteer parts. And scientifically, the healthy volunteer trials are very interesting. You're often dealing with the first human exposure of a completely novel molecule.
Yeah.
You don't know quite what's going to happen, and sometimes it's a little bit exciting.
Have you had any interesting experiences with that first, typically it's a sentinel dosing of 1 or 2 patients. One might get the placebo, one might get the active. Have you experienced any situations where there's hitherto unforeseen or predicted events?
Nothing which has caused any sort of significant or lasting effects. But there certainly have been a few incidents where there have been some unpredictable side effects which have turned up. And I guess with maybe the first 1 or 2 cases of that, myself, my colleagues as investigators have looked at it and thought, it's probably not related, it's just a random occurrence. But then we will see it occurring again and again in the cohort, and it becomes apparent that it possibly is something which is drug-related.
Right.
But, quite unexpected.
Yeah, because, the first-in-human studies are designed as such with safety in mind, right? You're not just jumping willy-nilly into taking the drug into patients without doing your due diligence, and that's a lot of preclinical animal studies. You're doing a very low dose to begin with and then ramping it up in that single ascending dose design that you mentioned. but also you build in the number of safety checks, so sentinel dosing, so you're not like giving it to 10 people at once and hoping for the best. There's a lot in there, isn't there, to make sure that safety is priority.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the clinical trial industry is probably amongst the most highly regulated in the world.
Really?
And it's like that for a reason, of course.
Yeah.
The safety of the participants who are giving up their time is paramount, and we need to make sure that everything that can be predicted has been accounted for in the design of a trial and the safety monitoring. Yep. Obviously there were a couple of very serious incidents that occurred in early phase trials in the UK and in France going back, 10, 15 years now. And I think that the industry responded to those well. The fact that there's not been a further event since 2016, despite the number of research trials that are occurring increasing, exponentially. I think that probably is a good indication that the response that the industry had, obviously in terms of the sentinel dosing, making sure that there is a good SRC or DSMB review between cohorts, and that all of the safety data as well as PK and PD data is all reviewed. I think that response has been the right one, and has further strengthened the industry to make sure that things are as safe as possible.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you wouldn't be a bit nervous about partaking in a trial if you knew that there was a non-insignificant chance of something going awry, but we can see now with the framework that's been in place, it's pretty good. You can't guarantee anything, of course, first in human, but by all accounts, pretty good approach. So looking into the future, where do you see the New Zealand clinical trials space moving? It's obviously grown heavily in the last COVID. Really, there was a bit of a bump during COVID, and I think it's been sustained since because of the fact that we were isolated, didn't lock down the way the rest of the world did. But aside from that, where do you see the industry going?
I think there are a number of challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. Some of these can be done sort of at a individual site level, and some of them probably rely on changes in government policy. I think that developing a program for young investigators coming into research for the first time is something which needs to be improved. There are a number of postgraduate courses which can be quite useful for investigators, but there's nothing particularly tailored and no sort of set out curriculum for what the steps are between going from very first exposure to a clinical trial, never done anything like this before, through to being a principal investigator, and whether or not that's transferable across different phases of studies, or whether early phase trials should be perhaps treated a little bit differently because of the potential for risk. So that's one thing, and it's something which I've given a bit of thought to, and hopefully over the next 12 months or so something will be developed at least through PCRN.
Excellent. Yeah, because without the human capital, can't actually carry out the research, right? Without the expertise. So there's no formal avenue for training or awareness. You can learn on the job, but that's less efficient. If you had a postgraduate course that you could do, learn everything straight away, maybe do some part-time work in a unit to get that exposure, and then hit the ground running. That'd be awesome.
That's it.
And the government side of things, what are your thoughts there?
Well, I attended Oz Biotech, when was that? Back in November last year. And, it was attended by state premier, and federal government officials. And that's not just a one-off. There is very high investment by the Australian government into clinical trials. They've obviously had this tax rebate program in place now for about 17 years, and that has made early phase trials, and I guess to a probably a lesser extent the later phase research as well. But in particular, the growth of early phase research in Australia has been huge over that period of time. And the numbers which were quoted just really show how successful that program has been. It's now, for each $1 invested, a return of $3.40.
Wow.
So it's not only bringing more research opportunities into the country, it's retaining science and medical graduates within the country, but it's also profitable for the state and for the federal government.
Yeah, that's remarkable. So we really need something like that here. We need that overt, visible, tangible support from government, but also some kind of scheme that makes it more attractive.
Yeah,
and incentivizes research to come here.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of potential for that area to grow. It wouldn't be without controversy.
Everything. Everything in this country.
The kind of rebates which were offered to, film production companies.
I wonder what the return on that investment would have been.
Would give us a sort of hint as to how it might be perceived by the general public. Giving tax breaks to multi-billion-dollar companies is probably never going to be a great line to sell. But it's kind of changing that mindset. It's not that you're giving them money back; it's just that you're taking a little bit less.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, it's not free. It's a rebate. So it's just reducing your tax take a little bit, but not completely. Yeah. And to say that for every dollar you invest, you get a $3 return for the Australians have gotten from their program, and then I'm not sure where else you could get that kind of return. If I invested and got 3x back over a couple of years, I would be very happy. So, definitely need to maybe change. But that's like a lot of things in New Zealand, where culturally it's an interesting place in that we have the tall poppy syndrome thing. We're very quick to cut each other down, and we kind of consider ourselves like the little brother or little sister of Australia. So it's like, oh yeah, that's fine. We won't do that over here. But there's a lot of great research and medical device technology and a little bit of biotech that's happening here in New Zealand that would be a shame if there wasn't more eyes and more dollars sloshing around to support it, because there's a lot of great people, great technology, great opportunities. Needs to be a bit more focus on making the most of that, I believe, personally,
And those studies are also coming from new places. We're still seeing a lot of studies coming out of North America and Europe and Japan, but increasingly a number of startups and biotechs out of China.
Right.
So there's a lot of growth in the APAC region.
Yeah.
And I think New Zealand needs to be prepared for that.
Yeah, definitely.
There's a lot of potential for growth there.
Yeah. Exciting stuff. So it won't just be one unit on the North Shore, it'll be multiple around the place then, Paul?
I think we'll start with one. Get that off the ground.
Get that one right.
Things are going well.
Yeah. Nice.
But, as I say, we've had a lot of interest and a lot of positive feedback from the people that have come around and seen the unit. So stay tuned for whether there's more units on the way.
Absolutely. Maybe to wrap up, do you have any advice for potential investigators or people that are interested in a clinical research career in an investigator capacity, what advice would you give to them, or what suggestions would you have to find out more or figure out if it's the right thing for them?
Look, I think increasing the awareness of it is one of the first things. It's still the case that most people fall into this industry.
Yeah.
So something which we're looking at is running some summer studentships or scholarships for medical students, and that's something which
Nice.
may be in place within the next year or two, hopefully.
Yeah.
So that will hopefully sort of just increase the awareness that there are opportunities outside of the conventional GP practice or hospital-based medicine. And there are all of these interesting things happening out there in the biotech world, which, you can actually be a part of and form a career in that.
Yeah. I mean, when your ex-hospital medical colleagues get access to new drugs, you can say, hey, I worked on that 20 years ago. Because 10 years to get it approved and then 10 years for Pharmac to, fund it and for it to be available.
Right, yeah.
So it takes a while. Yeah. Well, that's really exciting. I've often talked about the upskilling side of things, or just the awareness side of things, not just in clinical research, but in, commercialization of health technologies in general. You need to be aware of something to get an interest in something to figure out if it's right for you and pursue it as a career. But if there's not that visibility that it's an option, then it won't even be considered. So I think that's really, really cool. Well, Paul, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. If people want to get in touch with you or PCRN, where can they go?
Just check out pcrn.co.nz, or you can email me, Paul Hamilton, at pcrn.co.nz.
Love it. Well, thanks again, Paul. Cheers.
Thanks a lot, Charles.